Please go ahead. Thank you. And I'm assuming you can see my screen and everything's going fine. Yeah, good. Um, Actually, yeah, I've listened to Stephen. It's really I mean, his core of this co-creativity is actually what inspired my thinking here in intentionality and where do we place intentionality and who is to blame. So, and also this came out of just to give you some background. This last year, I was part of a scholar group with Graphic Study at a Duquesne University, led by Dr. John Slattery. And we gathered just once a month doing some readings, focus on AI and ethics, and we just allowed the conversation to move us, each one of us leading the conversation. And the more we talked about the co-creation aspect of AI, and it really like it's when you get to the ethics, it's like who is to blame? It kind of just led me down to this rabbit hole of intentionality. We talked a lot about relationships, so you're going to hear a lot of mirroring and what I'm going to be sharing this morning in regards to that. Also, to kind of put a side note on it is that I'm speaking out of the Roman Catholic perspective. So, in theologically, I'm kind of breaking in our definition of sin, our understanding of what sin is and sin isn't, using St. Augustine, especially as expressed through Aquinas, to kind of give you an understanding of where that is. But a lot of those are shared over the Christian perspectives. So begin. I like to always begin, and I probably use this quote more than any other quote whenever I write about technology, is from Pope Francis and a general audience to young people. He reminded them, and this he wasn't speaking to technology, but I think it speaks very well to where we are and situated, and it reflects well where he was toward the end of his writing. He says, "Today we live in a world that when we were young we could hardly imagine." I think that's very true. We couldn't imagine, it sitting here in this the state of Texas, running around outside, 30, 40 years ago, I was a streetlight kid. We never touched digital anything. There's three TV channels. And if you miss something, you miss something, right? I mean, you were always outside, always doing. We were the analog kids. And then now I'm living amidst this world and raising kids and this like digital AI world and working with students and working with adults. You're trying to make sense of this. And we never could imagine that we have landed here. And the ethical questions is asked us to think about. We never could have imagined this just 10, 15 years ago, that we would have to be, pressed to sort of think about these type of things, especially within the walls of the Catholic Church. We kind of just have always been a very physicality type place. We like the tangible, the physical, the Eucharist expresses through the Catholic Church is for that reason, right? We like the physical. But at the same time, now we're kind of thinking about this digital space and what does it mean to work in this digital space. And then, of course, you go into like the manipulation and things like that that happens with algorithms. And it's become really just a mad dash to try to make sense of this world that we didn't imagine before. So the paper itself, I kind of just played around with it, and I'm still kind of develop these ideas, kind of going back and forth and thinking about it. But there's like four broad, very broad ways that I approach this idea of like who is to blame, this idea of intentionality. The first thing is AI yesterday and today and tomorrow. And then I looked at sin and evil, like defining sin. And then also looking at the autonomy and creativity and like what exactly should our attentions be when writing and coding AI? And as user experience, what should our attentions be with AI? And then I ended with like this theology of everyday experience. And the reason I ended sort of like this practicality is because I'm a practical theologian and I always have like the youth in my mind about like, constantly on their phones, constantly doing this, X, Y, and Z. But I'm also thinking about how, like, just recently my Microsoft Word updated, and now I can press a button, and suddenly within 2 seconds, my Word document can start writing for me. And it's just become such, or when you Google something now, the first thing that comes up is not your website or book or whatever you do, you get a summary of everything. It's become such a thing. And so I thought of like play like, well, intentionality, who is this, who is that, and like how does it integrate in our everyday lives to us become more reflective on these when we're kind of faced with this AI in our face and what we're doing with it and using these tools. And I'm going to walk you guys through each one of these parts, just to kind of think about why I chose these parts and to give you a little insight in the research that I did per one. The first one is AI yesterday, today, and tomorrow. One thing that I've seen and noticed, especially in Catholic Church circles, is we actually have no idea where AI came from. We really have a sense, and at the University of Dallas, for example, which where I'm housed at, we have had really strong conversations about AI and the writing of papers and the fear of our young students cheating and using it. And then on the other side of working in ministry, homiletics. The amount of bishops who I've talked to is just astronomical. It's like my priests are using AI to write their homilies, and what do I do about this? We're having all these these questions about it. But when you talk to them, it's almost like this thing that was just sort of created out of a vacuum. Like we woke up one day and this tool was in front of us. And I think that's something that we need to sort of backtrack in this particular context and say, no, this has been around since the 1940s. I mean, this idea of this artificial intelligence as something would be thinking for us, and that we could, offset human thinking behavior to this machine has been around back when science fiction was all the rage, and the 40s, but among the baby boomers, as we say, it was really big and really prevalent. And we began to so I began to back there. I said, no, no, this is deeply rooted in something that's been going on in our human culture for quite some time. This is not something that just came out of thin air. So I began there and kind of looking at the history of AI. And within that, I found a really nice way to sort of, graph it together. And it was the seasons of AI, which I think are significant, because then you can kind of think, well, what season are we in? Because we do change quite often in the seasons of AI. And this comes from Hanlon and Kaplan's. They wrote a brief history. It's a short journal article, but I think what they framed here was really helpful, and kind of just sort of saying, where are we going with AI, and where is it leading us? And they talk about AI Spring and the birth of AI, that back in MIT days, and they were having these conferences at Brown University, and they were kind of talking about this idea of giving machines human capabilities. We said that's sort of the AI Spring. That was like the sunrise of AI and this idea of artificial intelligence. And then they kind of go in and they say, well, the AI summer and winter, those are our harsher seasons, right? They're extremities. Like, wherever you are, winter could be really brutal in terms of weather. And in summer here in Texas, we can hit easily 115 and have humidity added to be 125, it feels like on some days. So you have like these really extreme up and downs. And that's sort of where they situate this. And I think if I were to say like a season that we are in, I would put us in AI summer or winter. I think we're like in this constant ebb and flow of extremity. There's since it's like one day that we're like, yes, AI is fantastic. It has helped us. I mean, there's lot my husband works in cybersecurity, and we debate this all the time, like how much AI should be used in coding and things like that. And he's very anti-AI. He's like, no, it has to be the coder. The machine can't do everything, in terms of his day-to-day productivity. I'm more loose with it. I'm like, and he was scandalized once when I told him I used AI a little bit, when I have to come up with a really good title for a paper, because I'm terrible at titles. I was like, I go in there, I'm like, I give it like sort of a synopsis or my abstract. I'm like, tell me some good titles for this. And I keep playing with it and playing with the words, and helps me wordsmith. And he's like, I don't even know you anymore. It's like, you go into, it's like this up and down. We're fearful, and then we're embracing it, and we're going back and forth. And the same thing is happening in our institutions. It's like, on the one hand, we're finding good things. Pope Leo, it was mentioned labor. And as we saw in one of the very first quotes of Pope Leo explaining his name, of taking the name after Leo the 13th. He said he's concerned with AI's labor, and the human. There's this unique thing about human and work and labor. There's also AI in fall, and this is the harvest. When we go in and it's like something really great is created, and we go in and harvest it. And I think fall, this harvesting can happen at any point in the seasons, and it's kind of hard to situate it. These are not perfectly absolute, but seasons, even though we have dates to them, they kind of blend, right? So right now we seem to be in a perpetual spring in Texas, with really nice, cool weather, even though we're staring down summer. So even though we have a date to summer, it doesn't feel like we really hit summer until several days, almost 100 days into the summer sometimes. So we kind of think about these things, and where we're going with them, and these constant movements, and the history. So I thought that was a really great way to look at AI, to kind of ground us and understand that AI is just like, again, part of this human creation we've been dealing with a long time. And it helps us better understand the intentionality of the original formators and creators. And of course, I end where will AI take humankind next? We don't know. If you talk to the Silicon Valley, researchers here in America, they are constantly giving like doomsday perspective of where AI is going. If you talk to some of my colleagues in liberal education, it's doomsday. It's like this is terrible. This is going to kill our field, and I'm not really quite sure if it should be doomsday rhetoric. I don't know. I think a lot of it though will depend on us understanding the ethics, us understanding like the sort of like the ebb and flow of like the intentionality and why these tools were created and not just why they were created, but the user experience and why we are using them. I think that's really important. So from there, I kind of transition into evil and sin. It's like, if we're going to talk about the evil acts, as the church refers to that, the sinful acts and evil. We talked about man and machine, and it's sort of like, well, who's responsible for this? And one of the reasons I came to this, I kind of am, when I grew up and I was formed in my education, we talked about the nuclear weapon a lot, right, in our U.S. history and the bombing of Japan, and things like that. And then it was like, well, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And that was the question that we often were left with in our classrooms. Just because we can have these atomic bombs doesn't mean we should use them. And I kind of see a little bit of that when we talk about this coding and algorithmic of AI. Just because we can create algorithms that can really guide people and manipulate them to do certain behaviors doesn't mean we always should, or be that codified. And that's sort of where I began with this idea of intentionality. It's and many and I also work with a great deal number of parents, and working with their kids and understanding the digital things. Our children, when they go in and eventually they gain the wisdom as you go along. But when they first start messing with like Google or, whatever the taste or flavor of the day of a search engine, or just going into YouTube, whatever they're searching, they don't really always realize in young age that they are being manipulated by the algorithm. Uh, and that there's a coder that says, well, if they do this behavior, you are going to show them this. And yeah, sure, it's supposed to react to what you tell the machine, but sometimes the coders are creative and they're like, yeah, but I want to sell a product. And not everything that's shown to you based on your behavior is good and necessarily a good thing for the child or for the human adult. I mean, there's things that I've happened. I'm sure we've all encountered where we put something in our research and we're kind of like, and we come across the most vile things. And we're like, but that's not what I want. Why is that coming up in my algorithm? Is my algorithm poisoned? We go through all these different types of things. And then I think about, well, is it a machine? Is it sort of like an accident within the machine, or was there somebody that really intentionally created this algorithm? And sometimes we just don't know. We don't know the human mind to that extent to where, like, when this person created or coded this, they actually created it in a way to manipulate us to do something evil or go into something or the dark web or something like that and grab us in. So one thing that came through this is sort of like, well, then how do we judge these outcomes? And I used the work. I found this really great article in my research this last year, from Terzidi, Fabbuccini, and Lee. And they wrote this article called Unintentional Intentionality. Now, they did this completely on a different scale of things. They were looking at AI and art. As you know, when you go into like you're getting your pictures and things like that, now you can put in words and AI will create the perfect image for you. And sometimes they're terrible, but sometimes they're really good. And you're thinking, I couldn't think of a better way to express what I want to express in this image. And they wrote an article about it. Well, then, like, how do we judge this, right? How do we judge art and the creator? Like, is it the coder that gets creativity, sort of the acknowledgement, or is it the AI machine itself? Does the AI machine go rogue? And so they broke this down. And basically, they said AI outcomes should be judged not based upon the humans behind the writing of the algorithms or coding of the AI systems themselves, but rather AI should only be judged in relation to what its outcome is. So they kind of just looked at the machine itself and said, okay, we write these codes, we create something, but we need to not judge the person itself creating the code, but there's a sense of judgment of the machine. Machines are going to go rogue. We know this. We know viruses and everything else is that sometimes the computer, you tell it to do something, it does something different. And usually it's like because we told it wrong somewhere along the way. We messed up our coding, but we don't always know that. Our intentionality is not present in those situations. And so when they look at judgment, in terms of productivity out of machine, They place it back on the machine itself and says at the final outcome, and they called this unintentional intentionality. And the fact that the unintentional outcome, the coder messed up somewhere along the way, but the machine kind of goes rogue. And so even though the outcome or the product was unintentional, when you trace it back to the person creating, they said that the machine itself can be judged because it intentionally put something out because the machine made a decision, but not the person. I think this gets things very confusing very fast because then you're like, well, who's to blame? Like, is it the machine? Is it the person? Are we all being manipulated? Like, what? And then you think about co-creativity, and I keep thinking about along the line, somebody created, and it sort of goes back to this idea of Aquinas and his five proofs on God when he says you can't have infinite regress. I think in the same way with AI, you can't have infinite regress. Somebody along the line pressed the button, wrote the code, put this thing into motion. And so when you think about in these terms, you kind of understand a little bit better of where intentionality and really is to be placed in these type of ways. And so the question can be is can AI be separated from the intentions of its original creator? And when I kind of think about this, I'm like, no, not really. If you go through and you look at sin from the Roman Catholic perspective, and this was Augustine wrote on sin and three stages. Aquinas also quotes this in a little bit, some of his work. And he says there's three stages of sin. And so what is sin? And sin is a very broad term, so I think we can agree. It's just removing yourself from God, right? Your God gives us directives as human people, ethical directives, virtuous directives, higher being, however you frame God. And when we step away and said, I'm not going to follow those, that is sinful behavior. And it manifests in different ways. Augustine says there's three stages to this. There's the flesh, the mind, and the will. The flesh is that, I mean, he talks about this in his confessions. It's that immediate satisfaction, right? It's like doing whatever the body wants because it feels good, for the moment. And he also says there's a sin and he goes, usually the flesh, that sort of that physicality, that the craving of doing something for the excitement, like the endorphin rush, the adrenaline rush, those type of things. That usually goes into the battle of the mind. And then your mind is saying, it's like the devil's on your side and the angel on your side, the both on your shoulders. And the devil's like, yeah, do it. It's going to make you feel good. And the angel of the mind is going to say, no, that's not a good thing. God doesn't want us to do this. Or think back to, to your catechesis, your Ten Commandments. And maybe you should not think about this. What feels good may not do good. And, you have those battle of the mind. And so the second stage of sin, you're kind of going this mindful thing. But then he says the third stage, and if you don't get the stage right, or if you don't really listen to the will, this is where you fall into sinful behavior. As the will is that we have a really strong responsibility to respond to our will, and not just our own inner being will, but God's will, is that discernment happens. He had these two things proposed to you. And it's like, what do we do? And so when you look at AI and sin, and I think about going back to that person, the person that sort of set the dominoes in place to let everything fall into where it is. I think about, going into flesh, it feels really great to code something. And when I talk to young people and they're coding and they're gaming and they're just really excited. I mean, it's an adrenaline rush. Their minds are racing. And it's a really vibrant place to be with young people when they're talking about technology and you get them on this goal thing here. And so like this rush. And then they go through the discernment, the mind. It's like, well, is it good? Going back, just because you can does not mean you should. But then the will is like, well, I mean, who am I to judge? Who's God's will? Why can't I do it? It's going to bring me fame. It's going to bring me fortune. The Facebook creators are a really good example of this. Mark Zuckerberg and others had a few years ago, and this is pre-COVID, so it's been about 10 years ago now. They had this really famous panel where they sat down. They were talking about the creation of Facebook, like where did it come from, where this idea came from, the lore of it coming up in a Harvard dorm room. And Zuckerberg sat there and he said, we knew exactly what the like button would do to people. We knew it would give them an endorphin hit, that flesh, that first stage. We knew it and we did it anyway. We added that like button. And then from there, subsequently, there's been changes a little bit to the like buttons or to algorithms and things like that to sort of diminish the dopamine hit that they were giving. And now they said that, some of the creators of those early, algorithms said that they really regret that because they know that it's completely changed the minds of young people to adults in terms of what they do online in order to get those, and then the clickbait and all that that's happened from that. And that's the thing is like you get to this wheel point and you do these things, and then it's like the intentionality and the manipulation. But you also think of also the user. And so the idea is that can humans absolve themselves of the consequences of the tools they design? And I would even say the tools that they use, because there are algorithms that will manipulate you. There is a sense of power. And one of the things I quoted here is Fulmer. He wrote a short book on this, and he talks about Russell Fulmer, he talks about this idea of echo chambers. Like when I go in and I'm working in a social media or something like that, I may think that like I may be guided to really diverse thoughts and opinions. That's not always the case. The algorithms are created many because they want you to continue to engage, and oftentimes it's engage in like-mindedness. For example, if someone is like on X or even TikTok or something like that, and they like things over and over again, they naturally get an algorithm or their For You pages are created in a way that they get things that they naturally are already drawn to and like. For example, will follow anybody and everybody on X largely because I don't want my algorithm to be just one viewpoint. I don't mind, it doesn't offend me to see somebody that's just very different than me. In fact, I find it very in life giving because I can kind of think a different perspective and think about, correcting myself when I think maybe I thought things are wrong. But when you think about this though, but the average person doesn't. And what happens is Fulmer says we get into these echo chambers and things are just being echoed back to us that we want to hear. And one of the things an example I use is the current liturgy war in the Roman Catholic Church that you may be somewhat familiar with, is that the traditional Latin Mass, especially in American Catholicism, the traditional Latin Mass has been placed at war with the Novus Ordo or the post-Vatican II liturgy. We just had a recent bishop, the Diocese of Charlotte, Bishop Martin, who put out a letter. It got leaked out and it's caused a huge battle on social media. And what happens, and the fear is that these echo chambers have inflamed this liturgy war among whether you're Novus Ordo or the Latin Mass, and it's created these very isolated groups and polarizations. And you can add this to anything. I use this because it's a Roman Catholic example that's very live time for us right now. But you could do it politics. You could do it with parenting practices. I mean, these echo chambers create this polarization that happens. And it's like, so then who's at fault with that? Is it because of the user who's not smart or formed well enough to go in and to make the determination that they're being manipulated through these algorithms? Or is it the person who creates the algorithm itself? And so then I get within like this moral agency, and I landed on this really great idea that between the machine and the human being, only the latter is the moral agent, a subject of moral responsibility who exercises freedom in his or her decisions and accepts their consequences. So, and the Catholic Church, and looking at the idea of sin and so on and so forth, the machine is completely removed because we are the creators of the machine. We can't place moral responsibility on the machine, and I think that Stephen did that really well. And the relational because they don't think on their own. They're extension of us. They're like this a tool that we created. They're not human. So it's our moral agency. And I would say the moral agency happens both on the user end and the other. And that's why having really good technological formation on the human person is really, really important. So kind of zooming through, I also talked about autonomy and creativity. Humans do not always know how to retain power when it comes to technological stewardship. And I think that speaks to that formation piece. And I think it's really, really important to get formed so that when we go into these machines and we're dealing with algorithms, we understand that we ultimately as users, we have the power. The machine's not going to do things that we do not tell it to do. And even when the algorithms seem to go astray and become echo chambers, or we lose the diversity of thoughts, we have the power to change that, right? We have the power to follow people we may not necessarily always agree with, or to not immediately like something, to set our For You pages up very quickly, and those type of things. And so understanding stewardship is really important to understand our moral responsibility in terms of using these machines. And I also quoted here, I used a little, not a little bit, but I did splatter mention one of the last writings that we have under Francis's pontificate, Antiqua et Nova, and talks about artificial intelligence. And it talks about the commitment to ensuring that AI always supports and promotes the supreme value of the dignity of every human being. And the fullness of the human vocation serves as a criterion of discernment for developers, owners, operators, and regulars of AI, as well as its users. It remains valid for every application of the technology at every level of its use. And I think that speaks very well to that very beginning seed, the crazy scientist or the person who has this really creative idea that I'm going to create this machine or this algorithm. That dignity needs to be understood, and because when we recognize our dignity, we are naturally drawn to do good. Our dignity, our understanding dignity, and our purpose for that leads us to do good, and that's really important from formation, from the creator all the way through the user, with the machine removed from the middle. And the last part I did was theology and the daily experience in the digital world. And I ended with like the intersection of theology and technology highlights the importance of relationality. AI should be developed to strengthen meaningful human connections rather than replace them. And I think that's really important too. As Stephen pointed out, that the example of the young person, that is really common, really common. Our young people are more connected than ever before through their cell phones or, social media, but they're also more disconnected that we see ever before because they've gone into the digital space. They're not physically with each other as often as we once were. And I see it with my own kids. I mean, they're on the phone all day with their friends, gaming, doing this, that, and the other. And it seems vibrant and things like that. But I also asked my son, I'm like, maybe you should take the girlfriend out to a dinner and not just talk to her all the time. Like, I mean, there's a physical thing here, maybe, those type of things. And so we talk about those connections. And what's happened is young people who feel isolated, may not have friends, are talking to AI as it's a real person. And I even saw an example this last week where a person was looking for advice on life. And she's like, well, I just went to Chat GPT and said, I want to do X, Y, and Z the next 3 years and get my life back on track. Give me a game plan. And I thought to myself, just 2 years ago, that person would have been, a therapist. And now it's just a random algorithm that's telling her what game plan. And so we talked about, and going through the quote, theology underscores what, while machines may simulate interaction, they cannot embody the depth, empathy, and spiritual response of relationships. So we must be directed to fostering community. And if we get to that and we have really good, if we go back to the creators, and they understand to create algorithms and things that with the end goal is to foster community, to foster this, to foster human dignity. You're going to see the person, the machine removed, the person on the end, the user experience that's going to naturally guide them and hopefully guide them. So who is to blame? I think that's sort of like left into the air. I think we all have our own ideas of who is to blame. And then of course and I'm sure we could talk for hours about how machines go rogue, because they do. And I think that's a big fear in Silicon Valley, is that we can write a really great machine, but at the end of the day, sometimes computers do what they want to do. I mean, how many times I've cursed my computer in the morning because I tell it to do something, it's doing something else. And it's just a very interesting thing to be at this intersection of ethics. And I appreciate any questions. And thank you for listening.